I stood there, my heart racing, as the plane's engine roared in the distance. They'd promised to return, but the seconds dragged into minutes. My family, my own flesh and blood, left me behind at the airport, abandoned like an old suitcase. So I made a choice. I walked past the economy line and straight into first class. As I took my seat, I could feel their eyes on me from the gate. They never thought I'd make it this far. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Maggie sat on the curb outside Hartsfield Jackson, her worn suitcase beside her, and her eyes fixed on the stream of people rushing by. It was late afternoon. The heat still clung to the pavement, but there was no escape from the weight of the moment. The airport, bustling and indifferent, seemed like the perfect metaphor for her life these days, busy and full of noise. But she felt utterly alone. She glanced down the street, then at her watch. Evan and Dana had promised, "We'll be right back," their voices dripping with the assurance that this would just be a quick stop. A promise that, at this moment, felt like a cruel joke. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her bag as the minutes ticked by. She'd watched their car pull away, her son and daughter-in-law waving half-heartedly from the back seat. Maybe they hadn't meant to abandon her, she told herself. But that didn't make the sharp sting of neglect any easier to swallow. A slow, unsteady breath escaped her as she scanned the crowd. The endless flow of people, most oblivious to the woman left standing at the curb, was a reminder of just how easily she could fade into the background, just like they had intended. She rubbed her eyes. They wouldn't leave her behind. Not like this. But as the sun dipped lower, Maggie's optimism began to evaporate. 30 minutes turned into an hour. No sign of Evan or Dana. She checked her phone. No messages. She tried calling them, but the call went unanswered. The silence felt louder than any words ever could. "It's fine. It's fine." Maggie repeated the mantra in her head as if convincing herself would make it true. Her fingers trembled when she pressed the dial button again, but once more, the call went unanswered. The crackle of the intercom blared overhead, announcing the final boarding call for her flight. The weight of reality hit her like a punch to the gut. They weren't coming back. A gust of wind swept through the terminal, sending a scattering of paper cups across the pavement, and Maggie pulled her cardigan tighter against her frame. She couldn't help but feel the chill in the air wasn't just from the breeze. It was the coldness of being forgotten. Just as she was about to stand up and drag herself into the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Haley. "I'm sorry, Grandma." It was short, simple, but it cut through her like a knife. Blade Haley had always been the one person who saw her, who understood. And yet, there was nothing she could do. Nothing anyone could do to change this cruel, silent abandonment. Maggie felt her chest tighten. She fought the tears that threatened to rise, clamping down on the wave of humiliation threatening to swallow her whole. She had to keep her head up. She had to be strong. For Haley. For herself. She stood slowly, gripping the handle of her suitcase as she looked out over the airport once again. The modernity of it all. The digital billboards flashing, the endless stream of strangers, suddenly felt so distant. None of this mattered. Not anymore. The arrival and departure gates loomed in front of her like a reminder of how small and insignificant she was in this vast, indifferent world. With one last glance towards the empty curb where Evan and Dana had left her, Maggie made a choice. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. Not today. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She turned to see a young airport attendant standing a few feet away, a look of polite concern on his face. His uniform was crisp, his posture professional, and yet something in his eyes reflected the same coldness she had felt from everyone else. Maggie nodded, forcing a smile. "I think I can handle it." Her voice was steadier than she felt. She turned away, heading back towards the terminal. She had no idea where she would go, but she knew she had to move. She couldn't stay in this limbo forever. As she walked toward the check-in counter, she glanced at the departing flight list on the screen. There, in bold letters, First Class, New York. The sight of it pulled at her. She swallowed hard, the thought of leaving behind the cruel remnants of this day suddenly more appealing than she'd ever imagined. There was a moment, just a fleeting second, where the idea didn't seem so impossible. She could walk up to that desk. She could ask. And if they turned her down? Well, at least she would have tried. She felt the tremor in her hands as she gripped her suitcase, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and defiance. And so, she stepped forward. For the first time in years, she felt something that had been lost for so long, the possibility of control. The sliding doors of the terminal parted with a soft swoosh as Maggie stepped inside, the cool blast of air conditioning hitting her face like a slap. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back over her shoulder at the curb where she had been abandoned. The memory of Evan's last half-hearted wave twisted her stomach, but she pushed it down. This wasn't about them. This was about her. She walked up to the check-in desk with a quiet resolve. The agent behind the counter, a young woman with sharp features and bright eyes, smiled at her. "How can I assist you today, ma'am?" Maggie cleared her throat, steadying herself. "I'd like to upgrade to first class, please." The agent didn't blink, her hands already reaching for the keyboard. "Certainly. May I see your ticket?" Maggie handed over the economy ticket that had felt so inadequate only hours ago. As the agent typed in the information, Maggie felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest. This could be the first step toward reclaiming something she'd long lost, the ability to take control of her own fate. When the agent handed her the new boarding pass, it felt like a small victory. The words, "First Class," printed in bold, promising a seat far above the one Evan and Dana would be occupying. It wasn't just a seat. It was a statement. The agent smiled again, handing her a small slip of paper. "Your gate is on the left. Enjoy your flight." Maggie nodded and walked away, the weight of the moment sinking in with every step. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers following her, some curious, some disapproving. She didn't care. As she approached the gate, her eyes scanned the crowd. There they were. Evan and Dana, standing in the line for boarding, their faces locked in a blend of disbelief and annoyance. Maggie didn't have to look long to see the shock in their eyes as they noticed her walking toward the first-class queue. She could feel their stares burn into her back as she passed them, her chin lifting just a fraction. They hadn't expected this. The attendant at the gate smiled politely as Maggie handed over her boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." "Right this way." As Maggie followed the attendant down the jet bridge, the sounds of the terminal faded, replaced by the soft hum of the airplane's engines. The narrow hallway opened into the first-class cabin, a world away from the cramped economy seats she had once known. The plush chairs, the soft lighting, the hushed conversations, all of it felt like a different universe. "Right here, ma'am," the attendant said, gesturing to the seat beside the window. Maggie nodded and sank into the chair, the cushion enveloping her like a soft embrace. The attendant returned moments later, offering a glass of champagne. "Would you care for a drink, ma'am?" Maggie hesitated, looking at the glass in the attendant's hand. The bubbles glistened in the light, a stark contrast to the bitterness she had tasted just hours ago. She accepted the glass with a tight smile, the crystal cool against her fingers. "Yes, thank you." As the champagne tickled her tongue, the absurdity of it all hit her. This moment, this small, private triumph, was the revenge she hadn't known she needed. She thought of Evan and Dana, still standing at the gate, likely fuming with embarrassment as they watched her board ahead of them. They'd underestimated her, but she wouldn't let them forget it. She turned to the window, trying to focus on the city below, the lights shimmering like stars as the plane taxied toward the runway. But her mind drifted back to the scene at the curb. She could still see the empty space where their car had disappeared, leaving her behind. Her phone buzzed in her lap. Haley Maggie's fingers trembled as she unlocked the screen. The message was simple. Good for you, Grandma. Maggie swallowed hard, blinking back the unexpected sting in her eyes. She could feel the weight of everything she'd endured. The neglect, the humiliation, the loneliness. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. Haley had seen her. Haley had believed in her when no one else had. She looked down at the champagne in her hand and raised it slightly, as if toasting to the girl who still cared. To us, she whispered under her breath. The plane's engines roared to life as they began to ascend, and Maggie settled back in her seat, the soft fabric against her skin a far cry from the harsh reality she'd left behind. But just as the plane lifted into the air, a voice from below cut through the hum of the engines. Maggie? She glanced out the window and saw Evan and Dana standing at the gate below, staring up at her. Their faces twisted in a mixture of confusion and rage. Maggie's lips parted in the faintest of smiles. They hadn't just lost control of the situation, they'd lost her. The flight attendant came by again, offering a refill. Maggie smiled faintly, accepting the drink. Let them watch. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing as the plane soared higher into the sky. She wasn't looking back anymore. This should carry the momentum forward from the previous section and end with that moment of emotional release, setting up for what's to come next. How does this feel for the tone and pacing? The moment the plane touched down in New York, Maggie felt the subtle shift in the air. The cabin was filled with murmurs as passengers gathered their things, their voices a blur of anticipation for the arrival. But Maggie sat still for a moment longer, her gaze fixed out the window as the wheels screeched against the tarmac. The city stretched out below her like a canvas of possibilities, its lights like fireflies blinking in the distance. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, a wave of emotion threatening to sweep over her. I'm here. I did it. The hum of the engines wound down and the door opened with a soft hiss. Maggie stood slowly, taking a moment to adjust to the new space, to the unfamiliar feeling of having chosen this moment for herself. She wasn't just a passenger anymore, she was someone who had made it out of the cold, out of the shadows. This wasn't about Evan and Dana. This was about Maggie Turner, reclaiming her power. The air outside the plane was crisp, cutting through her as she stepped onto the tarmac. A few steps later, and she was in the terminal, scanning the crowd. It only took a second for her eyes to settle on him. A man with a weathered face, a tall frame, and the unmistakable presence of someone who had lived. Cliff Hayes. Cliff had been a pilot in his younger days. His stories of flying long-haul routes across the globe once filling hours of conversation over coffee or whiskey, depending on the day. He had always been there for her, in the way a loyal friend would be, offering advice, a listening ear, or just a simple smile when she needed it the most. Maggie, he said with a grin, his voice deep and gravelly with age. He pulled her into a hug, and for a moment, the chaos of the day seemed to vanish, replaced by the warmth of his embrace. You made it, huh? Maggie smiled, feeling a tear threaten her eye. I made it. They pulled apart, and Cliff looked at her, his eyes scanning her face. I see you're still holding your own, Maggie. Strong as ever. There was no need for pretense between them. Cliff had always known Maggie's strength, even when she didn't fully understand it herself. He was one of the few who could see beyond the surface, who recognized the quiet power beneath her wrinkles and gray hair. I've had to be, Maggie said softly. Things are different now. Cliff nodded, understanding without needing to hear the details. He motioned toward the doors. Come on, let's get you out of here. As they walked toward the exit, the bright lights of New York greeted her like an old friend, unfamiliar, yet comforting. They stopped by a cafe at the edge of the terminal, the hum of the city outside contrasting with the peaceful quiet between them. Cliff ordered them both coffee, and Maggie settled into the plush chair, taking in the comfort of the moment. As the steaming mug was set in front of her, she took a slow sip, the warmth easing her still rattled nerves. Cliff leaned forward, his face becoming more serious. You know, he began, I've been keeping an eye on a little business opportunity. Something that could give you a real leg up. Something you've earned. Maggie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on? Cliff smiled, leaning back in his chair. It's a small investment. Not huge, but enough to make a difference if you play it right. It's in real estate. Up-and-coming neighborhoods. I've got the connections. I could show you the ropes. Get you in on the ground floor. Maggie mulled it over, her mind working faster than her heart. This could be it. A way forward. Something to hold on to. Something I can control. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Sounds like just what I need. Cliff's eyes softened. You've always been more than capable, Maggie. You just need to see it in yourself. Just then, her phone buzzed on the table, the vibration cutting through the conversation like a knife. She glanced at the screen. Haley. Without hesitation, she picked it up. Grandma, I just wanted to tell you, they're furious. They can't believe you actually got on that plane. Evan's flipping out. Dana's acting like she doesn't know what happened. Haley's voice crackled through, laced with worry. Are you okay? Maggie's heart did a quiet flip. There it was. Proof that her departure wasn't just some insignificant moment. It was shaking things up. Evan and Dana hadn't just been inconvenienced. They were furious. Maggie let out a slow, measured breath. Good, she said, her voice calm, almost serene. Let them be furious. They need to know that I'm not just someone they can walk all over. Cliff's hand rested on the table, a silent gesture of support. You're stronger than you know, Maggie. But this is just the beginning. Maggie nodded, a small but genuine smile curling at the corner of her lips. She could feel the fire burning inside her. This was no longer about getting on a plane or escaping her past. It was about something bigger. It was about reclaiming her life, her power. She wasn't the woman they thought they knew. Not anymore. As she ended the call with Haley, Maggie set the phone down, her gaze turning to the bustling street outside. The world felt different from here, from this new vantage point, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt as though she was in control of the flight path of her own life. She turned to Cliff, eyes sparkling with a renewed fire. What's next? She asked. Cliff smiled back, his weathered face softening with pride. Next? We make sure they never forget who you are. Maggie stood in the sleek office lobby, the glass doors reflecting the bright lights of New York like 100 tiny shards of possibility. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she stepped past the towering potted plants and the sterile smile of the receptionist. Everything in this building felt too pristine, too polished. The world she was about to enter, however, was nothing like this. Cliff had set up the meeting with Rachel Kim, a no-nonsense attorney who specialized in estates and financial disputes. Maggie's fingers twitched at her sides as she approached the elevator, the familiar weight of her bag a reminder of how far she had come and how much farther she needed to go. The doors of the elevator slid open, and Rachel was waiting for her inside. Tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a power suit that screamed confidence, Rachel offered Maggie a firm handshake. Maggie Turner, she said with a brisk smile. It's a pleasure to meet you. Let's get to work. Maggie followed her into the office where Rachel motioned for her to sit. A large oak desk dominated the space, the walls lined with bookshelves that seemed to hold centuries of legal knowledge. But all Maggie saw was the folder Rachel placed in front of her, a thick file labeled Guardianship Proceedings in bold black ink. I've seen the papers, Rachel said as she sat across from Maggie. Evan and Dana have filed for guardianship, claiming you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs. They want control of your estate. Maggie's chest tightened. The audacity. The cruelty. She fought to keep her voice steady. I'm not incompetent. They're trying to take what's mine. Rachel nodded, her expression hardening. I'll fight for you, Maggie. We'll make sure the court sees through their lies. The words hung in the air between them, but Rachel was already flipping through the papers. They've provided no real evidence of your incapacity. Just vague claims. It's all about money. But we can counter that. We'll need evidence of mistreatment, of their neglect, of their cruelty. We'll show that they're only after your assets. Maggie's eyes drifted to the large windows behind Rachel's desk, the New York skyline stretching out before her. For the first time since her arrival, she felt the weight of the battle ahead. This is real now. There's no turning back. She cleared her throat, steadying herself. Haley. She can help. She's seen the way they treat me. She knows. Rachel's eyebrows lifted in interest. That's exactly what we need. We'll need Haley's testimony, and if she has proof, anything that shows Evan and Dana's true intentions, we can build a case that will hold up in court. A knock interrupted their conversation. The door opened and Haley stepped inside, looking as though she had walked right out of Maggie's thoughts. The young woman's eyes were wide with concern, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor. "Grandma," Haley said softly, rushing to Maggie's side. "Are you okay?" She hesitated, glancing at Rachel. "I have something. Some recordings. Of what they've said to me, to Grandma. About money. How they've talked about taking it all." Maggie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Haley." Her voice was thick with emotion, but she forced herself to smile. "You've done so much already." Haley nodded and placed a small digital recorder on the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed play. The voices crackled through the speakers, unmistakable. Evan's, his voice laced with greed, and Dana's, passive-aggressive and condescending. "We'll just have to manage her money," Evan's voice said, dripping with disdain. "She won't even know the difference. We'll put her in a home, somewhere out of the way." Dana's voice followed, icy and calm. "And once she's gone, it's all ours. No need for the hassle of caring for her anymore." Maggie's breath caught in her throat as the words hit her like a punch. She could feel the anger rise within her, but she forced it down, focusing on the present, on what mattered now. Rachel didn't look up from the recorder as the last words played out. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice cold and calculated. "They've just sealed their fate." Maggie's heart raced, but something inside her shifted. This wasn't just a fight for her money. This was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, her future. It wasn't about Evan or Dana anymore. It was about proving that she wasn't some helpless old woman who could be pushed aside and forgotten. "I'll fight," Maggie said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'm not going to let them take everything I've worked for." Cliff, who had been silent until now, gave her a small nod of approval. "You've got this, Maggie." "You're stronger than you know." Maggie looked between Haley and Rachel, feeling the weight of what lay ahead, but also the strength that came from having allies who truly cared. "This is my fight now," she thought, "and I'm not going down without a battle." As the meeting ended and the three of them left the office, the city buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing. Maggie felt the old, familiar surge of adrenaline. The battle was just beginning, and she was ready. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones, wrapping around your thoughts and making every word you speak feel like it's being judged by invisible hands. Maggie sat at the witness stand, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She'd been through many things in her life, but this was something else. Evan and Dana sat together at the opposing table, their faces hard and angry. They were the picture of confidence, but Maggie could see the cracks in their veneer. They were rattled, despite their best attempts to look composed. Evan, in his finely tailored suit, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed as if trying to will Maggie into submission. But Maggie wouldn't bend, not today, not anymore. The judge, a stern man with deep-set eyes and the air of someone who had seen too much, glanced between the papers in front of him and the scene unfolding before him. Judge Whitman was a man of few words, but his presence alone demanded attention. Maggie could feel his gaze flicker over her, scrutinizing her every move. She'd been ready for this moment, more than ready. Evan stood, his voice smooth and authoritative, the perfect image of someone who thought he was always in control. "Your Honor," he began, his gaze fixed on the judge, but his words were aimed at Maggie. "My mother." Maggie Turner here has been showing signs of confusion for quite some time. She's forgetful, disoriented, and unable to manage her own affairs. I've seen it firsthand. She's made poor decisions that put her at risk. He paused, looking directly at Maggie with a calculated expression. She needs help. She needs someone to care for her, to take control. Maggie clenched her fists under the table. He wasn't telling the truth. He never did. He was twisting the narrative to suit his needs, just as he always had. Dana, sitting next to Evan, let out a dramatic sob, her shoulders shaking as she fanned her face with a tissue. Maggie didn't buy it for a second. Dana had never been the emotional type. This was a performance, and she was giving it everything she had. Your Honor, Dana's voice cracked. Maggie can't even remember the simplest things anymore. I'm scared for her. She needs care, constant supervision. I don't want to see her end up in a facility, but we can't let her make any more decisions on her own. It's for her own good. Maggie could feel the bile rising in her throat. This was the woman who had called her a burden behind her back, who had treated her with thinly veiled disdain for years. And now, here she was, playing the concerned daughter-in-law. Maggie's turn came next. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She stood, facing the judge with a calm, unwavering gaze. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. I am not confused. I remember everything. Dates, numbers, events. I've worked my entire life managing my own affairs. I've been independent. I am independent. My mind is sharp. What they are claiming is not only false, but it is an attempt to take control of my life and my estate. This is about greed, not care. The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She saw Evan shift uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Dana's face was flushed with frustration, but she didn't speak. Maggie was in control now. Rachel, sitting at Maggie's side, rose from her seat. Your Honor, she said crisply, I have evidence that disproves these claims. Haley Turner, Maggie's granddaughter, is here to testify about the treatment Maggie has endured at the hands of her own son and daughter-in-law. Haley took the stand next, her voice steady despite the nerves she must have been feeling. She explained how Evan and Dana had spoken about Maggie when they thought she wasn't listening, how they had mocked her, belittled her, and discussed how easy it would be to take over her finances once she was out of the way. Haley's testimony was damning, every word backed by Maggie's own experiences. Then, Rachel presented the recordings. The room was still as Evan and Dana's voices filled the space, clear and unmistakable. We'll just have to manage her money. She won't even know the difference. We'll put her in a home, somewhere out of the way. Dana's cold, calculating tone followed. And once she's gone, it's all ours. Maggie saw the color drain from Evan's face. Dana's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was no hiding from the truth. Not anymore. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He took his time, looking over the evidence presented, the testimony given. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. Based on the evidence before me, I find no grounds for guardianship. Maggie Turner is fully capable of managing her own affairs. Guardianship is hereby denied. Maggie's breath caught in her chest, the weight of the moment sinking in. It was over. For now. She had won. But just as she was about to allow herself a moment of relief, Rachel spoke again, her voice low but sharp. Your Honor, there is one more thing. The judge's brow furrowed. What is it, Ms. Kim? Rachel placed a new set of papers in front of the judge, her voice unwavering. We've uncovered forged signatures on several joint accounts. Maggie Turner's name was used without her consent to make transfers. I request a full investigation into these fraudulent activities. Maggie felt her heart race again. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The piece of the puzzle that would finally break Evan and Dana's hold over her. The judge didn't say anything at first, but his eyes narrowed. He nodded slowly, his voice heavy with authority. We will look into this immediately. The investigation will begin. Maggie sat back in her chair, feeling a surge of triumph. But she didn't relax. Not yet. There was more to come. And she wasn't going to stop until she had taken back everything they had tried to steal from her. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the air thick with tension. Maggie's hands were still trembling from the rush of the last few moments. The victory of the guardianship denial, the shock of the recordings exposing Evan and Dana's callousness. But now, as Rachel rose again, Maggie could feel the next wave coming. It wasn't over. Not yet. Rachel was calm, unflinching, as always. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents, each sheet heavier than the last. The air seemed to still as Rachel turned to face the judge, her gaze focused and intense. "Your Honor?" Rachel began, her voice cutting through the room like a sharp blade. "What we've uncovered here is not just negligence or neglect. It's fraud." Maggie Turner's signature was forged on several of her joint accounts, and substantial sums were transferred out of her name without her consent. Maggie watched as the judge leaned forward, his stern face shifting from curiosity to a hard edge of disbelief. Rachel held up one of the forged documents for him to examine, a bank transfer document, Maggie's name scrawled across it in a signature that didn't look anything like hers. The dates were wrong, the amounts larger than Maggie had ever authorized. It was an intricate, deliberate scheme to steal from her. Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. These documents were signed and submitted without Maggie's knowledge or permission. The transfers were made to accounts controlled by Evan Turner and his wife, Dana Turner. Maggie's heart pounded as the room fell into a deep, unsettling silence. Evan's face had drained of color, his confident facade crumbling in real time. He shifted in his seat, looking nervously from Rachel to the judge, his eyes wild with panic. "This is absurd!" Evan suddenly blurted out, standing abruptly, his hands shaking. "These are all lies. I never forged anything. It's Dana. She—" His voice faltered as he realized he was pointing the finger at his wife. His eyes flicked to Dana, who was frozen, her lips pressed tightly together, her face pale with fear. Dana's eyes widened, her expression quickly morphing into one of disbelief. "Evan, don't," she started, her voice cracking. But it was too late. The accusation hung in the air between them, an invisible thread of blame unraveling the fragile trust they had built on deception. Evan's panic escalated as he turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor, I don't know what she's talking about. I didn't do this. Rachel wasn't fazed. She calmly placed another document in front of the judge, one that clearly showed the sequence of transactions. This was all done under Evan Turner's direct control. His signature matches the one used on these transfers. Evan's mouth opened in a desperate gasp, his eyes darting wildly around the room. I didn't. This is all a misunderstanding." Maggie sat still, her gaze steady. She had seen this moment coming for years, seen the way Evan would try to twist the truth and cover his tracks. But now it was his turn to be exposed. The judge's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he read over the documents Rachel presented. The room was heavy with the weight of what was happening, every word a nail in Evan's coffin. After a long moment, Judge Whitman finally looked up, his voice low and stern. "This is criminal. Fraudulent activities of this magnitude cannot be ignored." Maggie felt a strange calm wash over her. The fight had reached a tipping point, and it wasn't just about taking control of her estate anymore. It was about justice. The law was on her side. And, for the first time, she was truly in control of her own future. The judge turned to the bailiff. "I'm ordering an immediate investigation into these forged transfers. Evan Turner will be required to surrender all financial records related to these accounts for review." His eyes flicked to Evan. "I expect full cooperation, or I will have no choice but to issue an arrest warrant." Evan's face twisted with horror, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to hold himself steady. He looked at Dana, who, despite her earlier protestations, was now completely silent, her head bowed in shame. Maggie could hear the faint, strangled whisper of Dana's voice as she spoke under her breath. "This is your fault, Evan. You did this." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of resentment. Maggie stood and glanced at Cliff, who had been watching the scene unfold from the back of the room. He gave her a brief nod of approval, a small, reassuring smile that let her know she wasn't alone. Haley, sitting beside him, leaned toward her, her voice a quiet whisper that carried the weight of her growing confidence. "They'll pay for this, Grandma. You've got this. They can't escape anymore." Maggie's heart swelled with a strange mixture of pride and relief. Haley had always believed in her, and now it was Maggie who was showing Haley that strength, showing everyone that a woman who had been overlooked for so long could rise, unshaken, and fight for what was rightfully hers. The judge slammed his gavel down with finality. "Court is adjourned. I will review the evidence, and further action will be taken." Maggie stood tall as the room emptied, her pulse quickening with the realization that this was only the beginning. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming everything they'd tried to steal, but she wasn't finished yet. As the doors of the courtroom swung closed behind her, Maggie turned to Rachel, Cliff, and Haley, feeling an electric buzz of determination. This battle was far from over, but it was hers to win. The courtroom had grown colder in the weeks since the hearing. Maggie hadn't expected the process to be quick, but she hadn't anticipated the mounting pressure either. The stakes had only grown higher, but each day that passed brought her closer to the end of this battle, and she was ready for the war to be over. Rachel had been relentless in her pursuit. The investigators had traced the stolen funds, digging into every transaction with the precision of a surgeon. The fraud was no longer a vague accusation. It was a reality that Evan couldn't escape. And when the evidence came to light, it hit hard, even harder than Maggie had imagined. Today, the courtroom was a tense, expectant silence. The rows of seats were filled with spectators, the air electric with anticipation. Maggie sat in her usual seat, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was calm, her resolve hardening like granite. It was all unfolding exactly as Rachel had promised. Rachel stood at the front, poised and confident, her voice cutting through the air as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, after extensive investigation into the accounts linked to Evan Turner, we have uncovered a trail of fraudulent transfers. These funds were taken from Maggie Turner's accounts over the course of several years, funneled into various hidden accounts that Evan Turner controlled." Maggie's stomach churned as she saw Evan's face flicker with disbelief, his hands gripping the edge of the table in front of him, knuckles white. His gaze flicked around the room, desperate, darting like a cornered animal. His reputation, carefully constructed over decades, was shattering, piece by piece. Rachel continued, her tone unwavering. "The transfers were made in the amounts of hundreds of thousands of dollars, all of them unauthorized by Maggie Turner. These funds were moved without her knowledge or consent. The signature used to authorize these transfers was forged." Rachel then presented the evidence, a detailed timeline of every fraudulent transaction, each one clearly showing the movement of money from Maggie's accounts to those controlled by Evan. Maggie didn't need to look at the documents to know what they contained. The weight of the situation was heavy enough. She had seen the truth in her own time. As Rachel spoke, the room's tension mounted, but it was Dana's reaction that cut through the air like a blade. When Rachel reached the final page of evidence, Dana leapt to her feet, her face contorted with rage and fear. This is all lies!" Dana screamed, her voice shrill. "He didn't do this. You have no idea what you're talking about." Her eyes darted to Evan, pleading, but his face was an open book of panic. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Evan didn't speak, his face turning ashen. But Dana wasn't done. She was losing control. "Evan, you can't let them do this to us," she shouted, her voice breaking. Her outburst was followed by a loud bang, the judge's gavel smashing against the wood in front of him, demanding order. "Enough!" Judge Whitman's voice rang out, filled with authority. "You will remain silent, Mrs. Turner, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Dana's sobs filled the room as she collapsed back into her seat, her face red with anger and humiliation. Evan, on the other hand, was frozen in place, his mind clearly racing through damage control strategies, but it was too late. The fraud trail was undeniable. Maggie stood, steady as ever, her gaze fixed ahead. Her voice, when it finally came, was calm, unshaken. "This isn't revenge," she said, her words clear and sharp. "This is accounting." The room was still for a moment, and Maggie felt the weight of her statement hanging in the air. She wasn't fighting for something petty. She wasn't vindictive. She was simply fighting for what was hers, what they had taken from her. And the law would see that. Judge Whitman, who had been silent, his gaze steely, turned toward the bench and nodded slowly, his face grim. "I've heard enough." He paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "Evan Turner, I am ordering the immediate seizure of all your assets pending further investigation. This includes all bank accounts, real estate, and financial holdings associated with you. Any attempt to transfer or hide assets will be met with criminal charges." Maggie's heart raced, a mix of triumph and bitter relief flooding her chest. This was it. The man who had tried to steal from her, manipulate her, and break her had finally been caught, and he would face the consequences. The judge's voice continued, heavy with finality. "Further, I am ordering a full forensic audit of the Turner family's financial transactions for the past 5 years. The investigation will continue, and I will ensure all criminal actions are fully prosecuted." Evan slumped in his chair, his eyes wide, his mouth agape. There was no more playing innocent. No more pretending. His empire was crumbling. Maggie turned to Rachel, her eyes meeting the attorney's for just a brief moment. Rachel gave her a subtle nod, the smallest of smiles curling at the edges of her lips. This was Rachel's victory as much as Maggie's. She had been the one to bring the truth to light. Haley, sitting beside Cliff, couldn't hold back her smile. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "You did it. They'll never get away with it." Maggie gave her a soft smile in return, feeling a wave of gratitude for the girl who had been her rock throughout this battle. Haley had believed in her when no one else did. As the gavel came down one final time, Maggie stood tall, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. There was more to do, more to fight for. But this victory was a milestone. Evan and Dana had thought they could take everything from her, but they had underestimated her. They had underestimated Maggie Turner. Maggie sat at the front of the courtroom once again, her eyes fixed straight ahead. There was a quiet finality to the air this time, as though the long, winding journey was coming to an inevitable end. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The fraud, the forgeries, the stolen funds. Evan and Dana's attempt to control her life had crumbled under the weight of truth. But the battle for her estate, for the future she had worked so hard to build, was far from over. Evan stood at the opposing table, his face pinched with a look of pure determination. This was his final play. His last attempt to claw his way back from the precipice, his desperate last-ditch effort to wrest control of what he believed was rightfully his. Rachel had already submitted Maggie's new trust. It was airtight. Every clause, every sentence carefully crafted to ensure that Maggie's wishes would be honored. The new trust, the new will, were no longer just documents. They were the sword and shield Maggie needed to finally put an end to their manipulation. The judge who had presided over the fraud case was now reviewing the contents of the estate planning document, his brow furrowed as he skimmed through the papers, pausing every so often to make notes. This was it. The final verdict. Maggie wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her legacy, for Haley, for everything she had built over the years. "Your Honor," Evan began, his voice shaky but steady enough to still carry an air of authority. "I contest the validity of my mother's estate planning documents. I believe they were created under duress, and there are significant discrepancies that call into question their authenticity." The words felt hollow, as if Evan knew, deep down, that this was a losing argument. But Maggie's resolve only grew stronger. She knew Evan's game. He was still trying to manipulate the narrative, still attempting to twist things in his favor. This was nothing but another ploy to take what was hers. Rachel stood, unfazed. She cleared her throat, and in a voice that was both firm and calm, she addressed the judge. Your Honor, the trust in question has been reviewed by experts. All signatures were verified, and the documents were prepared in full accordance with Maggie Turner's wishes. The evidence is clear. There is no duress, no foul play. This is Maggie's final decision. And the sole beneficiary of her estate is Haley Turner. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Maggie could feel her heartbeat in her chest. Haley, her granddaughter, the one person who had believed in her when no one else did, was the one Maggie had chosen. The room was heavy with the finality of it all. Maggie turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Haley's. The young woman sat a few rows behind her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Haley's eyes met hers, and Maggie could see the flicker of pride in her expression. This is her inheritance too, Maggie thought. Not just the money or the property, but the legacy of strength and resilience that had been passed down through the generations. Dana, who had been sitting quietly beside Evan, suddenly exploded from her seat. "This is ridiculous!" she screamed, her face red with fury. "You can't just hand everything over to Haley. You're leaving me with nothing. You're abandoning me." Her voice cracked as she spat the words out. The courtroom buzzed as Dana stormed toward the door, her high heels clicking angrily against the floor. She didn't turn back as she stormed out, but her outburst had left the air thick with bitterness. She had tried, and failed, to claim what wasn't hers. Maggie couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction at the sight of Dana's retreat. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. About finally having the power to make the decisions that were hers alone. The judge looked at Dana's retreating form, then turned to Maggie. "It's clear that the documents are legitimate. The trust stands. Haley Turner is the sole beneficiary of Maggie Turner's estate." Maggie exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over her. It was over. Finally. Evan and Dana had underestimated her, thinking they could control her, manipulate her, and steal everything she had worked for. But they were wrong, and now the law was on her side. Cliff, who had been sitting quietly behind her, leaned forward and whispered, "You've secured the flight path, Maggie." Maggie smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the judge's final order. She had fought for herself, for Haley, for everything that had been taken from her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Maggie felt in control of her own fate. The legacy she left behind would be one of strength, defiance, and resilience, a legacy no one could take from her. As the gavel came down, final and unyielding, Maggie knew she had won. Not just the case, but her life back. Maggie hadn't expected peace to come easily, but the calm she felt after the court's ruling was quickly disrupted by an unexpected voice. It was Caleb, Evan's closest ally and a man whose presence she had long considered as a necessary evil in her life. He was tall, his sharp jawline and steely eyes making him a force to be reckoned with, but Maggie knew his type, all bluster and intimidation. The phone call had come late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to fade into the horizon. Maggie had been sitting at the kitchen table, quietly reflecting on everything she had fought for. But the sound of her phone buzzing shattered the momentary stillness. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end certainly wasn't. "It's Caleb," he said, his voice low and measured. "You think you've won, Maggie? You think this is over? You have no idea what I can do to you." Maggie froze for a second, but the familiar weight of fear was nowhere to be found. Instead, she felt something sharp, something cold and calculating stirring within her. Let him threaten, she thought. It will only make him more predictable. "I don't need your threats, Caleb," Maggie replied, her tone icy. "You've been part of this scam long enough. You think I don't know what you're capable of? He laughed darkly. Oh, I'm not talking about your little inheritance. I'm talking about your reputation. You're a fraud, Maggie. Everyone's going to know what you've been up to. I'll make sure of it. All it takes is a little whisper, and the damage will be done. Her stomach twisted as she processed his words, but she didn't flinch. She wouldn't. Maggie had seen enough of his kind to know that they thrived on fear. He had no real power over her anymore, not after the court ruling. I'll ruin you, Caleb continued, his voice growing more venomous. I'll make sure no one believes a word you say. You'll be a laughingstock. But just as Caleb continued his rant, a familiar sound cut through his threats, the soft click of a phone being set to record. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Haley. The click had been deliberate, a signal that Haley, ever the quiet observer, had already begun to document Caleb's threats. She'd been at the kitchen table with Maggie, sitting just out of sight, but her ever-watchful eyes were never far away. You can try, Caleb, Maggie said, her voice calm, steady as ever. But you'll be the one paying for it. I won't let you hurt me or anyone I care about. Caleb's laugh turned to an angry snarl. You'll regret this. Don't say I didn't warn you. Maggie ended the call without another word, her fingers tight on the phone. Haley looked up at her with steady eyes, nodding toward the recorder. I got it all, Grandma, she whispered, a hint of pride in her voice. Every word. Maggie smiled faintly, pride swelling in her chest. Haley was her rock. Always had been. She'd grown into the kind of woman Maggie had always hoped she would become. Strong, capable, and never afraid to fight back. Later that night, Rachel filed elder abuse charges against Caleb, citing not only the threats, but his long-standing role in enabling the manipulation of Maggie's finances and the fraudulent transfers. Rachel's words were succinct, but the impact was clear. Caleb would not get away with this. The next day, in the courtroom once more, the judge issued a swift ruling. Caleb, like Evan and Dana, would face legal consequences. The judge ordered a restraining order, banning him from any contact with Maggie or her estate. But it wasn't just the legal ramifications that gave Maggie peace. It was the certainty that Caleb's grip on her life had been severed. The relief was short-lived. As they walked out of the courthouse, Maggie's thoughts drifted back to the scene in the courtroom, Dana's face when the judgment had been passed. The final vestiges of her control had slipped away, and she'd cracked in front of everyone. Dana had stormed out, and Maggie hadn't even looked back. She didn't need to. But there was one more surprise waiting for Maggie, a twist in the tale of this long journey. Days later, as she perused the paper, she saw an auction listing, a foreclosed home, the address. It was Evan's. Her heart skipped. How fitting, she thought. The house that had once been the symbol of his life of privilege and entitlement was about to be sold, and Maggie, with her newly secured wealth, had the power to buy it. She felt a grin tug at the corners of her lips. What if we bought it? Maggie said to Cliff, who sat beside her on the couch, his eyes following her gaze. He raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile spreading across his face. Now that, he said with a chuckle, would be a final stroke of genius. Maggie's hand moved over the paper, her finger tracing the listing. A final symbol of freedom. She wasn't going to simply leave Evan with nothing. She was going to take his last possession, the one thing he had clung to, and make it hers. With a final nod, Maggie set the paper down. Let's do it. I'll buy his house at auction. And as she stood, feeling the weight of her decision settle around her like a mantle of power, Maggie couldn't help but whisper, "The sky is clearer now." Maggie stood outside the grand, stone columns of the house she had once known only as Evan's house. Now it was hers, and it felt different, bigger somehow, as if it were reclaiming its true purpose under her ownership. The lawn stretched wide, neatly manicured but now dotted with patches of untrimmed grass, a testament to Evan's neglect in recent months. She ran her hand across the stone archway, her fingers lingering on the cold surface. This place, she thought, had always been a symbol of their control over her. a reminder of the life they believed was theirs by right. But now, as she stood here with the official papers in her hand, she understood what true power felt like. The sale had gone through quickly, even faster than she'd expected. With her wealth, her purchase had been smooth. No complications, no games to be played. The auction had been a public spectacle, but the moment her bid had secured the house, Maggie felt a calm, quiet satisfaction. Behind her, Haley stood with her arms crossed, a proud smile on her face. "It's all yours now, Grandma," she said, her voice soft but full of pride. "You really did it." Maggie turned toward her granddaughter, her eyes meeting Haley's. In that look, there was everything. Years of suffering, yes, but also the strength to rise above it all. Haley had always believed in her, even when Maggie had doubted herself. "I couldn't have done it without you," Maggie replied, her voice steady and true. "You're the reason I fought." Haley's smile widened, and without saying another word, she stepped forward and wrapped Maggie in a tight hug. The kind of hug that spoke of understanding, of shared triumph. As the two of them stood there, the sound of a car engine hummed through the quiet neighborhood. Maggie turned to see Evan and Dana's car parked in front of the house, an all-too-familiar vehicle that once held the promise of wealth and superiority. But today, it was the symbol of their failure, the remnants of their shattered pride. They stepped out, their faces flushed with a mix of disbelief and indignation. Evan looked at the house as though it were a mistake, as if somehow it didn't belong to Maggie or to anyone. Dana clutched her purse, a look of utter humiliation etched into her features. The neighbors, gathered in small groups along the sidewalks, watched in silence, their murmurs rising like a low hum in the background. Maggie didn't move. She stood tall, the weight of her decision anchoring her. She wasn't about to shy away from this moment. Not this time. Haley, sensing her grandmother's quiet power, smiled slyly and whispered, "I bet they didn't see this coming." Dana's eyes met Maggie's, her lips curling into a sneer. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, her voice sharp and bitter. "You've stolen everything from us. This isn't over." Maggie's expression remained serene. "It's not about winning, Dana. It's about ownership. Real ownership." Evan shot Maggie a look that could have burned a hole in the pavement. His eyes, wide with the unmistakable sting of humiliation, flickered from the house to his wife, as if looking for an answer, any answer, on how to fix this. But there was no fix. Not anymore. "You think you've beaten us?" Dana snapped again. "You're nothing but a survivor," Maggie interrupted calmly, her voice unwavering. "I didn't beat you. I survived you." The neighbors whispered amongst themselves, some with pity, others with quiet admiration. It was clear that the tables had turned, and the turners were no longer the imposing figures they once were. Cliff, standing by the gate, caught Maggie's eye and gave her a subtle nod. "Tables turned indeed," he said, his voice filled with approval. His gaze flickered to Evan and Dana, who had started to walk away, heads bowed in defeat. Maggie turned back to the house, her fingers brushing the surface of the gate as she smiled quietly. For so long, she had been made to feel small. So many years of watching from the sidelines, waiting for approval, waiting for permission. But no more. She had earned this. This was her victory, and it was not to be taken from her. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the property, Maggie felt the full weight of the moment sink in. This house, this legacy, will be built on my terms. She was no longer at the mercy of others. No longer afraid of being forgotten, abandoned, or pushed aside. Evan and Dana had tried to break her, to steal her future. But now, as the sun set behind her, Maggie Turner stood as the new owner of everything they thought they could claim. The final piece of the puzzle had been placed, and Maggie was at peace. The mugshot of Evan Turner flashed across the screen, as cold and unforgiving as the man it depicted. His eyes were hollow, a mixture of fear and disbelief that couldn't be hidden behind the layers of arrogance he once wore so effortlessly. The image spread quickly across social media, dissected by hundreds, if not thousands, of people who had once admired him, or at least feared him. Now they gawked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Maggie watched the image appear on her phone, her heart not racing with triumph, but with something deeper, more complicated. She hadn't asked for this spectacle, but she had earned it. She hadn't just survived her son's betrayal, she had witnessed the full extent of his fall. And it wasn't over yet. Across town, Dana's name was being whispered with the same venomous curiosity. The once esteemed woman, who had strutted around their social circles like a queen, was now being shunned. Her image had collapsed as rapidly as Evan's. Dana's frantic attempts to salvage her reputation only seemed to dig her deeper into the hole she had created. Maggie had heard the rumors. People were avoiding Dana, deliberately creating distance, not wanting to be seen as associated with her. Social gatherings where Dana had once been a fixture now had empty chairs, as if the universe itself had decided to uninvite her from the life she had once tried to claim as her own. Maggie, on the other hand, walked through her days with a quiet dignity. No grand gestures, no loud proclamations. She didn't need them. The world knew her strength now. She had shown that she was no longer a victim. She had stood tall and fought for what was hers, and in doing so, she had claimed a space in the world that would not be easily erased. As Maggie sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, the weight of everything she had been through seemed to lift off her shoulders, just for a moment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. But even that was a difficult thing to savor, knowing how much had been lost along the way. Haley walked in, her steps light but filled with a confidence Maggie had never seen in the young woman before. The girl who had once been shy, uncertain of her place in the world, had found her strength through this battle. Haley was standing beside Maggie now, her arms crossed, but her eyes were full of pride. "You taught me strength," Haley said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of everything they had both experienced. "I didn't realize what I was capable of until I watched you. You didn't just survive, Grandma. You thrived." Maggie smiled faintly, turning to Haley. She hadn't expected her granddaughter's words to be so emotional, but in them, Maggie found a deep sense of peace. Haley had always been the quiet observer, but now Maggie saw in her the same resilience she had carried for so long. "I didn't do it alone," Maggie replied, her voice steady, but the hint of emotion was unmistakable. "You've always been there." Haley nodded, her eyes shining. "We did this together." Meanwhile, in the world of legal battles, Rachel was finalizing the last of the paperwork, the final steps in unraveling the last pieces of Evan and Dana's empire. The amount of paperwork Rachel had sifted through to untangle the fraud, the hidden transfers, and the years of deception was staggering. But Rachel, ever calm and efficient, handled it like she always did. Methodical, precise. She had been Maggie's unwavering ally throughout this entire ordeal, and the moment was finally here. Evan and Dana's financial reign had crumbled, and the law was ensuring they couldn't escape it. As Rachel signed the last document, her expression softened. "It's over, Maggie. Everything is finalized. The house is officially yours, the fraud is officially uncovered, and Evan's assets are being seized." Maggie looked up from her coffee cup, a slight but genuine smile tugging at her lips. Finally. Cliff, who had been standing nearby, offered a quiet smile of approval. "You've outlasted them all, Maggie." Maggie nodded, her gaze distant but satisfied. The weight of the past few months had taken its toll, but now, as the final chapters of this story were written, Maggie knew one thing for sure. She had won. Just then, Haley came over and hugged her tightly. It was a hug filled with all the quiet love and understanding they had built together. For Maggie, it was the only thing that mattered now. Out of the corner of her eye, Maggie saw the reflection of the setting sun, its light casting a golden glow through the window. For the first time in years, Maggie allowed herself a moment of peace. Her enemies were broken, her strength had been proven, and she was free. The phone buzzed again. This time, Maggie didn't look at it right away. She didn't need to. The past was finally behind her. The future was hers. The office was quiet, the soft rustle of papers the only sound in the room. Maggie sat at the polished oak desk, her hands resting gently on the final draft of her will. It was simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had fought for. Her fingers hovered over the signature line, her pen poised in midair. She had come a long way since the days of meekly deferring to Evan and Dana's demands. This moment wasn't just about money or property. It was about taking back the autonomy that had been stripped away from her for far too long. The final will was her declaration of independence, her way of ensuring that her legacy would be built on her own terms. It was a victory, but also a declaration of the future she had finally claimed for herself. Cliff stood by the window, his back to the light, watching as Maggie prepared to sign. He had been there through the darkest of times, but now he was watching her shine. Maggie had proven herself in ways he'd never expected. Even after years of friendship, Rachel sat across from her, flipping through legal documents with the precision of someone who had seen it all before. But even she, a seasoned attorney, couldn't help but feel the significance of this moment. This wasn't just another contract. This was Maggie's rebirth. Haley stood next to her grandmother, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the will. She hadn't said much, but the depth of her emotions was clear in the way she held herself. For so long, Haley had been a quiet observer. But today, she stood beside Maggie with the quiet strength of someone who had witnessed the transformation of her grandmother from a woman who had been broken to someone unshakable. Maggie finally lowered the pen to the paper, her signature flowing with ease, but each stroke held the significance of everything that had come before it. The house, the estate, the power that had once been stolen from her. Now it was all hers to give. She passed the pen to Cliff, who signed his name as a witness, followed by Rachel, who did the same. It was simple, but as the ink dried on the paper, Maggie felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. For a long moment, no one spoke. The finality of the action seemed to settle into the air, the silence filling the room like the quiet after a storm. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the room. It was a peaceful, serene moment, but underneath it, there was a sense of quiet power. Haley, her eyes shining with emotion, walked over to Maggie's side and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Grandma. You really did it?" Maggie looked up at her, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We did it, Haley," she said, her voice steady, yet full of emotion. "You've been with me through all of it." Haley's voice cracked as she spoke again. "I never knew how strong you were, Grandma. But now I see it. You taught me. You taught me what it really means to fight." Maggie felt her heart swell with pride. The battle had been long, the cost steep, but this moment made it all worth it. Haley wasn't just inheriting wealth. She was inheriting Maggie's strength, the real legacy. Cliff watched the exchange between the two of them, his eyes soft with admiration. He had known Maggie for years, but it was in moments like this that he truly understood the depth of her resilience. Maggie had fought for herself, for Haley, for everything that had been taken from her. And now, she was passing on that legacy. Rachel, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "This will stand, Maggie. You've made sure of that, and I'll make sure it's enforced, every step of the way." Maggie nodded. "I'm not worried anymore, Rachel." The sky's clearer now. The room seemed to hum with the energy of a battle won, but it wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about reclaiming what was always hers, a future without fear, without Evan and Dana's manipulation, a future where her granddaughter would carry on the strength and resilience Maggie had worked so hard to build. As they left the office, Haley's hand slipped into Maggie's, and they walked side by side, the weight of the world finally behind them. Cliff walked ahead, a content smile on his face. And for the first time in so long, Maggie felt the full weight of her victory, not as a burden, but as something she had earned. Her legacy, now safely secured, was more than money. It was the power to decide her future. It was a future of freedom, a future of peace, a future that no one could take from her. And Maggie Turner was finally free. Maggie had never expected Evan to come crawling back. But here he was, his back hunched, his clothes disheveled, and his once proud face now a mask of desperation. He stood at the foot of her front door, looking more like a man who had lost everything than the self-assured son she had once known. Haley, standing beside her, was the first to notice him from the window. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice tense. "It's Evan." Maggie's breath hitched, but she remained steady. She had waited for this moment, in a way, knowing that Evan's ego would never allow him to truly accept defeat. Now, he was here, broken, seeking something he thought he could never lose, her forgiveness. Without a word, Maggie turned and walked to the door. Haley followed closely behind, her phone in hand. Maggie had learned long ago to expect the unexpected, but she also understood the power of quiet strength. She wasn't about to let this man take one more inch of her peace. As she opened the door, Evan fell to his knees before her. His face, once so full of arrogance, was now contorted with genuine regret. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Mom, please," he begged, his eyes brimming with tears. "I know what I did was wrong. I was selfish. I was blinded by greed. But please, I'll make it right. Just forgive me." Please, Maggie stared down at him, her expression calm but unyielding. There had been a time when she would have fallen for this. The pleading, the promises, but not anymore. "Forgiveness is free, Evan," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. "Money isn't." Evan's eyes widened and his hands shook as he reached out to her. "Please, I never meant for things to go this far. I was wrong. I'll make amends. I'll do anything." But Maggie didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her back straight. Haley stood quietly behind her, the phone capturing the moment. This final humiliation for Evan. He had come to beg for forgiveness, but what he didn't understand was that forgiveness was not something Maggie owed him. She had already given him everything she could for years. This time, he was the one who had to face the consequences. The neighbors, who had gathered quietly along the street, whispered among themselves. Some watched with sympathy, others with curiosity. Maggie's victory had been swift and dramatic, and now, as Evan knelt before her, it was a final public spectacle of his downfall. Cliff, who had been standing on the porch, made his way toward them. His face held the same quiet approval it always did, but there was something more. Something final, almost like a closing chapter on the story that had once been Maggie's life. He placed a hand on her shoulder, standing with her in this final moment of reckoning. Evan lifted his gaze, his eyes pleading, but Maggie didn't falter. "It's over, Evan. You've done enough damage. I've given you every chance to make things right, but this isn't about you anymore." Haley filmed quietly, her eyes never leaving her father's crumpled form. She was calm, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way she held the camera. This moment was just as much hers as it was Maggie's. It was the final proof of what they had endured and what they had overcome. With a final, almost imperceptible nod, Maggie stepped back. "You're not welcome here anymore, Evan." Evan hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words, but none came. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his eyes burning with a mixture of humiliation and anger. He had come to beg, but he had nothing left to offer. His empire had fallen, and with it, any semblance of control he had once held over Maggie and her family. Maggie didn't watch as he walked away. Instead, she turned back inside, Haley still filming. She didn't need to see his retreat. She had already won. Moments later, the sound of police sirens echoed down the street. 2 deputies pulled up in their squad car, stepping out with calm authority. They'd been watching, as had the neighbors, and now it was Time to make sure that Evan's stay in the public eye was as uncomfortable as it could get. Maggie turned to Cliff, her face serene. "It's done." Cliff gave her a small, knowing smile. "Not just for you. For everyone." As the deputies escorted Evan away, Haley lowered her phone and gave her grandmother a proud look. "They'll never hurt us again," she said softly. Maggie nodded. "No, they won't." But there was one more thing. As the weight of the final chapter settled over her, Maggie knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still so much to do, so much left to build, but she had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, had found a purpose that went beyond just surviving. That's when Maggie made her final decision. The next day, the press released the news. Maggie Turner, having secured her estate and her future, had donated a significant portion of her wealth to a new senior travel fund. It would provide opportunities for abandoned elders, giving them the chance to see the world in their later years, just as she had always dreamed. Maggie had never been motivated by revenge. The power she had reclaimed was never meant to be wielded against others. It was a tool to help those who had been left behind, those who had been forgotten. The article ended with a quote from Maggie. "Forgiveness is free. Money isn't. But you can always choose to make the world better with whatever you have left." Maggie Turner's legacy was not one of bitterness or revenge. It was one of strength, resilience, and giving back. And with that, Maggie knew her story would never be forgotten. The sun rose over the tarmac, casting a soft glow on the small, gleaming aircraft that awaited its passengers. Today wasn't just another ordinary day. It was the start of something Maggie had dreamed of, a legacy that would carry her name and her strength forward, far beyond the walls of her past. She stood on the edge of the private terminal, watching as the first group of seniors made their way toward the plane. They were grinning, some shy and reserved, others laughing in disbelief at the opportunity they'd been given. For these men and women, many of whom had spent their later years in loneliness, disconnected from the world outside, today marked a new chapter in their lives. Maggie felt a swell of pride as she watched them board, their faces lit with excitement. The Golden Flight program was more than just a charitable gesture. It was her way of giving back, of taking her experience, her pain, and transforming it into something positive. These were the elders who, like her, had been overlooked, forgotten, and left behind. Now, they were about to see the world through a different lens, one that was filled with possibility. Haley stood beside her, her eyes scanning the crowd of seniors with a proud smile. As the trustee of the program, Haley had embraced her role with the same quiet determination Maggie had shown throughout the years. Together, they had built something extraordinary. Haley had learned from the very beginning that change didn't come easily, but when you worked for it, when you fought for it, the world had a way of bending to your will. "It's happening, Grandma," Haley said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "This is everything you've dreamed of." Maggie nodded, her heart swelling in her chest. She looked down at the group of seniors now settling into their seats, their laughter and chatter filling the air. She could almost see herself in them. Once unsure of what the future held, once left to wonder if she would ever be seen, ever be valued. But now, as their lives were about to unfold in front of them, she knew it was all worth it. The press had arrived earlier in the day to cover the launch of the program. Cameras flashed, capturing Maggie as she made her way down the steps toward the plane, Haley by her side. It was a moment that had been years in the making. Maggie didn't smile for the cameras the way she used to. There was no need. She knew this wasn't about her, not anymore. It was about all the people who had been overlooked, who had lived in the shadows for far too long. Maggie Turner, the philanthropist who turned her pain into purpose. One of the reporters murmured into the microphone. Another camera captured her looking up at the plane, her gaze steady and proud. As the last of the passengers boarded, Maggie turned to Cliff, who had been standing at a distance, watching with the same approving smile he always had. He had been with her through the darkest moments of her journey, her most loyal friend and confidant. Now he looked at her with a quiet admiration that spoke volumes. You did it, Cliff said, his voice low but full of pride. You turned a lifetime of hurt into something good. This is your legacy. Maggie smiled, the lines of her face softening with the weight of his words. It wasn't just me, Cliff. It was everyone who supported me. Haley, you, all the people who believed. He nodded, his expression soft but knowing. But you made it happen. This is the way forward. As the plane's engines hummed to life, Maggie turned to Haley. Are you ready to watch them fly? She asked, her voice filled with something both light and heavy. Haley's eyes shone with pride. Ready, Grandma. Ready for the world to see them too. The doors to the plane closed and the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. Maggie stood there watching the plane lift off, the sound of its engines a distant hum in the air. She had worked for this moment her entire life, not for fame, not for glory, but for something more important. A chance to make a real difference. Now that's boarding first class, Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched the plane disappear into the sky. Haley turned to her grandmother, her eyes filled with admiration. You didn't just change their lives, Grandma. You changed the world. Maggie smiled, but there was no need for words now. She had done it. She had given them a chance to see the world again, and in doing so, she had found her own peace. It wasn't about forgiveness or revenge anymore. It was about taking what life had thrown at her and turning it into something beautiful. And she would continue to do that for as long as she could. With one last look at the plane, Maggie turned and walked back inside, her legacy firmly in place. Maggie stood at the entrance of the private terminal, her eyes fixed on the sleek, gleaming aircraft waiting on the tarmac. The last time she had seen this scene, waiting to board a plane, was years ago, and she had been left standing alone at the curb, forgotten, abandoned. But today, it was different. Today, she was walking into the plane on her own terms. Her heart beat steadily as she gazed up at the aircraft, her emotions a quiet mix of pride and finality. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had endured. No longer was she an invisible woman left behind by those she thought she could trust. She was in control now, and nothing would take that from her. Haley stood beside her, her face glowing with pride. It was hard to believe how far they had come, from a woman who had once been discarded to this, her legacy, her life, finally restored. Cliff was close behind them, his calm, steady presence always reassuring, always grounding. He had been with Maggie from the start, and now, standing at the threshold of her final victory, he beamed at her with admiration. You've earned this, Maggie, he said quietly, his words full of meaning. You've earned every moment of this. Maggie turned to him and smiled, the weight of the years finally lifting off her shoulders. It's not about what I've earned. It's about what I've made. Her voice held a quiet strength, and in it, Maggie could finally hear the woman she had become. Powerful, unshakable, free. The stewardess on the plane greeted them with a warm smile. Welcome aboard, miss. Turner, she said, and Maggie, Haley, and Cliff stepped inside, the cabin as luxurious and peaceful as Maggie had imagined. It wasn't just first class, it was a new chapter. A chapter written by her hand. Once they were settled in their seats, the flight attendant served champagne, the cool glasses glinting in the soft light. Maggie raised hers, a quiet smile on her face. Haley and Cliff followed suit, and the three of them clinked their glasses in a moment of quiet celebration. This wasn't just about the champagne. It was about the journey that had led them here. The struggle, the pain, the triumph. To freedom, Maggie said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. To you, Haley added, her voice barely above a whisper. You taught me strength, Grandma. Maggie met her granddaughter's eyes and nodded. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about control. This was about the future, one built on Maggie's terms. She had been left behind before, but now she was leaving the past in her wake, soaring above it, untouched and unbroken. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Maggie's thoughts drifted back to that moment at the airport. The moment when Evan and Dana had left her standing at the curb. Forgotten. Humiliated. She remembered the sting of it. The disbelief. The loneliness. But now, as the wheels lifted from the ground and the aircraft soared into the sky, she could almost feel the weight of that moment lifting from her chest. It was behind her. The future was ahead. The landscape below began to shrink as they ascended into the clouds. The past, the pain, the people who had tried to break her. All of it seemed smaller now, insignificant. The world was vast, full of possibility, and she was in control of her own path. Maggie gazed out the window, her reflection in the glass steady and serene. She was flying, literally and figuratively, and nothing could hold her back now. "We made it, Grandma," Haley whispered, a soft contentment in her voice. Maggie smiled, but her thoughts were distant, focused on the horizon. She had made it, and for the first time in years, she felt completely free. This wasn't just a flight. This was her life, her legacy, her freedom. They had left her stranded on the ground, and now she was flying first class. For good.